What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL playoffs, championship games, top DFS picks.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL playoffs. Let's take a look at this 2-game slate. So at the quarterback position, I like Joe Burrow from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have the 9th worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Joe Burrow has averaged 23.8 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 4.7 rush attempts per game, and he's projected at 23 fantasy points here this week. He's 6,800 DraftKings salary. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game. They have the Bengals trailing by 1. So Joe Burrow has scored 21, 21, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 6, 5, and 3 rush attempts in those games. So I think he's the second highest rushing upside quarterback on the slate. Well behind Jalen Hurts, but he does have a great matchup here. We'll see how Patrick Mahomes responds to that ankle injury. I have a feeling he'll be able to keep the pressure on Joe Burrow to score the ball, and he's got the best quarterback matchup on the slate. So I like Joe Burrow here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. The other quarterback that I like is Jalen Hurts from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the San Francisco 49ers. Jalen Hurts has averaged 26.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11 rush attempts per game. He's projected at 27.9 fantasy points here this week. He's 7,200 DraftKings salary. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Eagles favored by 2.5. So Jalen Hurts scored 24 fantasy points last game. He had 9 rush attempts. So I think he has the highest ceiling on the slate with Patrick Mahomes dealing with that ankle injury. I love the rushing upside, so I like Jalen Hurts here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So stud on the slate is Christian McCaffrey from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Philadelphia Eagles, who have a good defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Christian McCaffrey has averaged 21.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.4 rush attempts per game and 6.4 pass targets per game. So he's projected at 22.7 fantasy points here this week. He's 8,000 DraftKings salary. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the 49ers trailing by 2.5. Christian McCaffrey has scored 18, 25, and 17 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And he got 10, 15, and 10 rush attempts in those games, on top of 8, 2, and 3 pass targets. So 18 touches last week, although Elijah Mitchell got 14 rush attempts as well. Wasn't all that productive, but that's a pretty high rush attempt count for a backup running back. 14 touches is pretty good for the backup to Christian McCaffrey. But Christian McCaffrey led it with 18 touches and clearly has the most upside on the slate. So I like Christian McCaffrey here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay, now, all things considered, considering salary, Christian McCaffrey, my number one running back. My number two running back on the slate would be Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have the 9th worst defense overall, middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Joe Mixon has averaged 17.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 15 rush attempts per game, 5.4 pass targets per game, and he's projected at 21.2 fantasy points here this week. He's 6,500 DraftKings salary. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Bengals trailing by 1. So Joe Mixon has scored 23, 9, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 20, 11, and 11 rush attempts on top of 3, 4, and 5 pass targets. So he led all running backs in the touch count last week with 23 touches, scored 23 fantasy points. We had a feeling that he would have a bounce back game after only putting up 9 fantasy points off of 15 touches the game before that. So he went out there and performed, and he's in a great spot this week. Now, because of the injury to Patrick Mahomes, it's less likely that the Kansas City Chiefs are going to blow out the Cincinnati Bengals. So Joe Mixon should be involved throughout this whole game here. So I like Joe Mixon here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Okay, now when you're looking for another running back here, there are 3 running backs I think you can consider all around $5,000 DraftKings salary. So the first one that I like is Isaiah Pacheco from the Kansas City Chiefs playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing running backs, but Isaiah Pacheco has scored 11, 12, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks. He got 12, 8, and 9 rush attempts on top of 1, 0, and 2 pass targets. So 13 touches last week is pretty decent. I'm hoping he can get 15 touches or more in this game. He's projected at 10 fantasy points, and he's 5,300 DraftKings salary. So I like this game because I do think that they're going to lean on their running backs, Isaiah Pacheco and some Jerick McKinnon as well. So you could go with either of those guys, but I like Isaiah Pacheco here versus the Cincinnati Bengals.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
So another running back that I like, although he's getting plenty of touches here, just been struggling throughout the season really to put up numbers on the ground or put up fantasy production. But I think you got to consider him here in a 2-game slate, considering all these guys are around 5K, and he's probably going to get the most touches out of anyone here. It's just how much is he, out of these 5K salary range running backs, under Christian McCaffrey, Joe Mixon, those are your top 2 running backs on the slate. Then you're kind of forced to pick one of these guys around 5K. So Miles Sanders has averaged 13.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 15.2 rush attempts per game, 1.5 pass targets per game. He is projected at 14 fantasy points here this week. He's 5,200 DraftKings salary. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points in this game. They got the Eagles favored by 2.5. So Miles Sanders has scored 9, 3, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 17, 11, and 12 rush attempts on top of 0, 1, and 0 pass targets. So not a lot of production from Miles Sanders, but I think he's worth considering here. Salary's pretty low. He's going to get a lot of rush attempts. If he can find the end zone, he should be able to hit value. So I like Miles Sanders here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, now the backup running back for the 49ers, the guy who got 14 touches last game behind Christian McCaffrey, I like Elijah Mitchell as one of these mid-range 5K salary running backs that you'll have to probably play one of. So Elijah Mitchell playing the Philadelphia Eagles, who have a good defense overall, but they're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Elijah Mitchell has scored 5, 11, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 14, 9, and 5 rush attempts, on top of 0, 3, and 0 pass targets. So 14 and 12 touches the last 2 games. That's pretty good volume. He's projected at 9 fantasy points here this week. He's 4,900 DraftKings salary. So Elijah Mitchell, I think, is a decent option here, just because it looks like they are going to run Elijah Mitchell, even though they have Christian McCaffrey. It looks like he's going to get 10 to 15 touches. So I think he's a decent play, although I do prefer Miles Sanders and Isaiah Pacheco. He's kind of the last guy that I would consider here as one of these lower salary running backs. I think he's a decent option, so I like Elijah Mitchell here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So, stud on the slate, you got Jamar Chase from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have the 9th worst defense overall, give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Jamar Chase has averaged 21.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 11.2 pass targets per game. He's projected at 24.9 fantasy points here this week. He's 7,600 DraftKings salary. Jamar Chase has scored 17, 23, and 23 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 8, 12, and 13 pass targets. So monster volume, monster production, and they didn't jack his price up at all, so you can fit him into your lineup no problem. So I like Jamar Chase here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. So the other wide receiver I like, you got A.J. Brown here sitting at 7,000 DraftKings salary, and he does have the most average fantasy points per game out of the Philadelphia Eagles wide receivers. He's coming in at 18.6 fantasy points per game. So you could absolutely go with A.J. Brown here, but I kind of prefer Devonta Smith from the Philadelphia Eagles. The San Francisco 49ers have a good defense overall, give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. I really liked Devonta Smith throughout the season, and I was on him last week as well. So Devonta Smith has averaged 15.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8 pass targets per game. And he's projected at 18 fantasy points here this week. He's 6,800 DraftKings salary. And Devonta Smith has scored 18, 14, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 10, 8, and 13 pass targets. Now, A.J. Brown has scored 5, 14, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 6, 10, and 9 pass targets. So in the last 3 weeks, Devonta Smith has got more pass targets and he's been more productive. But don't count out A.J. Brown after putting up 5 fantasy points last week. A.J. Brown could be set to have a huge comeback game here and, kind of disappoint the Devonta Smith owners. Because I have a feeling that A.J. Brown, I have a feeling his ownership is going to be pretty low coming off of that 5-point fantasy point game. Memories are pretty fresh here in the playoffs. If a player burns you, really hard to play them again the next week. So kind of thinking this through here, I think A.J. Brown as a tournament play and Devonta Smith as a cash play might make sense. But either one is good to go here. Both of them have good matchups. So I like Devonta Smith here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, now a couple of wide receivers that I think are pretty underpriced here because both of them had bad games last week, but they both have fantastic matchups this week. So take a look at T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. Those are the number one wide receivers behind Jamar Chase. So T. Higgins has averaged 14.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.8 pass targets per game. He just hasn't played well the last 3 games, only scored 6, 10, and 2 fantasy points off of 4, 6, and 7 pass targets. So he is projected at 14.5 fantasy points here this week, and he's only $5,400 DraftKings salary. So I do think you're getting a pretty steep discount on T. Higgins in a good matchup. I think he also could be a big surprise. Again, probably going to have lower ownership because of the memory or, that recency bias with the 6 fantasy points last week. But this guy averaging 14.6 fantasy points per game on the season, chances are he's going to revert to the mean or the average pretty soon here. So I like T. Higgins here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. And the same can be said about Tyler Boyd. He's way down at $3,800 DraftKings salary, averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.1 pass targets per game. So just right away, Tyler Boyd looks like a fantastic value play on this slate. He's projected at 10.5 fantasy points. Now, he's only scored 3, 6, and 10 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 2, 3, and 7 pass targets. But this guy is more than capable wide receiver, averaging that 10.8 fantasy points per game on the season at only $3,800 DraftKings salary. I love him as a value play, so I like Tyler Boyd here versus the Kansas City Chiefs.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
And the other wide receivers that are pretty cheap on this slate that could have some pretty big upside here, take a look at Deebo Samuel from the San Francisco 49ers. Now, the Philadelphia Eagles do have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing wide receivers. But Deebo Samuel has averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.2 pass targets per game and 3.2 rush attempts per game. And those rush attempts are still coming. The last 2 weeks, he got 4 and 3 rush attempts, so 7 rush attempts in the past 2 weeks. So he's projected at 13.7 fantasy points here this week. He's $5,700 DraftKings salary. And Deebo Samuel has scored 10, 32, and 4 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 7, 9, and 3 pass targets on top of 4, 3, and 1 rush attempt. So I'd really only look at the last 2 games because he came back from injury the game before that, didn't put in much work. But the last 2 games, he's getting over his average in targets and right about on his average or a little bit over on rush attempts. So getting plenty of work here, and he's at only $5,700 DraftKings salary. So I like Deebo Samuel here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. And now a value play on the slate, kind of a value play along the lines of Tyler Boyd, but I think he has a much better chance of having a big game here. Take a look at Brandon Ayuk from the San Francisco 49ers. He's averaging 13.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.7 pass targets per game. And he's been on the field for 92% of the snaps, projected at 13.8 fantasy points here this week. He's only $4,400 DraftKings salary. Now, Brandon Ayuk scored 5, 10, and 10 fantasy points in the last 3 games, up of 4, 5, and 5 pass targets. So not a great game last week, but his price tag
makes a lot of sense here. He's got pretty big upside. So I like Brandon Ayuk here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. So stud on the slate is Travis Kelce from the Kansas City Chiefs playing the Cincinnati Bengals. They have a good defense overall, middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. Travis Kelce has averaged 19.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.9 pass targets per game. Been on the field for 80% of the snaps. He's projected at 23.8 fantasy points here this week. He's 7,800 DraftKings salary. And Travis Kelce scored 36, 10, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 17, 7, and 10 pass targets. So be a little cautious with Travis Kelce here this week because of that ankle injury to Patrick Mahomes. But Patrick Mahomes is going to be playing, so he could just be dumping the ball off to Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce could get a ton of pass targets, but I do think they are going to have more of a run-heavy offense with a guy like Isaiah Pacheco and Jerick McKinnon. Probably going to run the ball a little bit more here, but I wouldn't count out Travis Kelce just because of that injury to Patrick Mahomes. He very easily could get 15-plus pass targets in this game and put up a monster line. So I like Travis Kelce here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. But now coming down in salary here, this is one of Brock Purdy's favorite targets. He likes to throw to tight ends. So take a look at George Kittle from the San Francisco 49ers. Philadelphia Eagles have a good defense overall, middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. George Kittle has averaged 13.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.7 pass targets per game. He's projected at 15.7 fantasy points here this week. He's 5,200 DraftKings salary. George Kittle has scored 15, 8, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 2, and 6 pass targets. So I like George Kittle here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, I had this guy on my radar last week. I think I mentioned that he was possibly one of my favorite tight ends on the slate due to his low price tag and low ownership, and I thought he was going to have a big game, and he did. So I like Dallas Goedert from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have a good defense overall, been good versus opposing tight ends. Dallas Goedert has averaged 12.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.8 pass targets per game. Been on the field for 89% of the snaps, projected at 14.4 fantasy points here this week. He's 4,100 DraftKings salary. Dallas Goedert has scored 17, 11, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 7, and 6 pass targets. So I like Dallas Goedert here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Now, we were all over these tight ends last week. We also really liked Hayden Hurst from the Cincinnati Bengals. And this week he's playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have the 9th worst defense overall. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So he does have the best tight end matchup on the slate. And Hayden Hurst has averaged 8.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.2 pass targets per game. He's projected at 8.9 fantasy points here this week, but he scored 17 fantasy points last week off of 6 pass targets, and his volume has been pretty good the last 3 games. He got 6, 6, and 5 pass targets in the last 3 games. Now, I like this play because he does have the best tight end matchup on the slate, and he's only 3,000 DraftKings salary. So I like Hayden Hurst here versus the Kansas City Chiefs.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com.
You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.